What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Josh Button podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Lyneil Mitchell. And if you're unaware of what Marinovich Systems are, or the podcast I did with Quentin Torres not that long ago, go back and check those out. Go dig in a little bit. We're going to get into a lot of things today in that area, in that field. But first, I want to know how you came to Marinovich Systems in the first place. Was it when you were a wrestler? Was it in college? Was this long after? Obviously, you have a ton of things to cover within your gym and your specialties, but give us the background first and foremost.
Yeah, and these are the reasons why I'm writing these books, right? Because it is just such an extensive history. So I'm 46. I'm almost the same age as you, right? And so, particularly with that, back then you couldn't just go on social media and find every answer that you were ever looking for to the point of confusion, right? And I played multiple sports in college, but wrestling was my main thing. I was a 2-time All-American, and I actually ended up with a really bad turf toe problem. And so basically I was really big into strength conditioning. I have an exercise science degree. My graduate assistantship when I was in grad school for physical therapy was to be an assistant wrestling coach and to be the strength and conditioning coach for our wrestling team, which was awesome. So I got to use my undergrad degree while I was getting my physical therapy degree and continue to coach wrestling, which, it was a joke back then that I was just going to stay in school forever because I loved that environment, right? And never wanted to leave. And then I left and went to the University of Cincinnati for 3 years. So, I spent 6 years at the university after I was done competing myself. But this turf toe injury that I had, I could go on and on about it, but I never managed it correctly. And I went to a small Division II schools. I also wasn't getting managed correctly. I had 9 cortisone injections in my foot in an 18-month time period. So my last 2 years, I was basically wrestling on one foot. And as I get into PT school, basically I start learning that I'm developing all these compensations and all of these problems that are going to get worse. And it was like, okay, what am I going to do? And kind of like, I made this comment the other day about the knees over toes guy doing this podcast with Quentin, and it kind of got taken out of context, but the physical therapy stuff wasn't necessarily working for me. Kind of the same thing with the knees over toes guy, but it was still the same physical therapy principles that I needed to take and find something that was basically harder and more intense to connect my foot back to the rest of my body. So if I jump back a little bit, I had started getting really into 2 things, which were concussions, which was at the time, I'm from the Pittsburgh area. So concussions were the new thing. All of that stuff was with the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you see that movie, Concussion. So Western Pennsylvania had it. It was the heartbeat of what was going on. We were way ahead of our time. And then the next thing was girls were tearing their ACLs with non-contact injuries up to 8 to 10 times more than boys. And so I kind of wasn't actually, to be honest, that interested in that. I just kept falling into it because it was such a big thing. Then here I am, I'm leaving Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania, and I'm going to the University of Cincinnati with the guys that specialized in female ACL tears, published the literature on how they happen, what are the risk factors and those types of things, and then also how to prevent them. So it was Bob Mangine, Tim Hewitt, Kevin Ford, and Greg Meyer was the research group out of there. And the cool part is I got to do research with them. Well, they had already kind of figured it out at the time of what the problem was, but because I had this bias with my foot, I was one of these people that was like super into the foot, right? I had this foot fetish, kind of like Quentin. I joke about that, right? And I had basically convinced myself at the time and some of the other mentors that I had went to in my own bias that the foot was causing the problem. And I went to this research group and I'm like, no, I want to do a study on the foot. So I had to learn all of the research studies or read all the research studies on what's the difference between being in your bare feet versus being in shoes, and how do your toe mechanics connect to your spine and all this type of stuff, and what also is correlated with dysfunctional biomechanics that may put somebody at risk for a non-contact ACL injury. So I get through all of that. My foot's still a mess. I know that it's a huge component to what I'm doing. I also am learning this very sophisticated neuromuscular rehab process that we're using to return athletes to sport at the University of Cincinnati, which at that time, nobody was really doing it. My boss at the University of Cincinnati, Bob Mangine wrote the ACL protocols that we use now in the late 80s. And they were basically called an evaluation based protocol with a neuromuscular emphasis, which is also what Tim Hewitt and those guys piggybacked on, looking at these neuromuscular protocols. And so at the end of it, I'm going, okay, I know how to do this rehab stuff. I know the traditional strength and conditioning type of things, which I also had to learn more for all these different sports while I was at Cincinnati, track and field, cheerleading, golf, all of that. I had to work with every sport and also the strength coaches. So I'm doing all of that and I'm going, this is not connecting. Right. We do this style of neuromuscular functional conditioning for the rehab, and then we just throw them back into the traditional model. And fortunately, Josh Rafferty, I don't know if you know that name or not. He was on the Ultimate Fighter season 1, and he had caught that BJ Penn was doing this barefoot type of training. And him and he had invited me to do some MMA work with him as a wrestler. They wanted to bring me in and basically see if they could beat me up with their jiu-jitsu and MMA stuff, right? You know how it was back then. Oh, you're a wrestler. Come on. We want to see if we can tap you out, right? And I'm like, oh, this sounds like a great idea. And so he was like, man, you have this bad foot. You should check out this training method. And so I looked into it and I ended up, buying the discs and the pipes, kind of like what a lot of people are doing with Quentin now. And then I scheduled a weekend intensive seminar with Gavin McMillan, and, it took off from there, and I was obsessed with it ever since. Sorry, I know that was long-winded.
No, that was great. So the turf toe thing, you actually seen many careers ended by turf toe in the NFL or other sports. Did you actually overcome it? Did you strengthen your feet through this Marinovich Systems and through other exercises that you found? And are you kind of 100%?
So I wouldn't say that I'm 100%, and I would say that I never got back to 100%. So I went, to see a foot and ankle surgeon. They were basically like, look, if we do the surgery for this, you may never be able to wrestle again. And I was like, well, I'm still wrestling now, so I'll just keep going here. And that was also part of the time when I started getting the injections. And it was just so weak that I couldn't function. And again, as a physical therapist, we have this mentality of like, well, if we can create neuromuscular strength around a joint, then we can get it to function correctly. But the problem is my ligaments had gotten so insufficient. It's kind of the same thing. After you sprain your ankle so many times, the ligaments just don't have any check to them, right? And so I would just push off in certain ways and not be able to have any stability, and my toe would just go, and bend the whole way back. But I eventually got back to coaching wrestling, and it did end my competitive career though. I took second in the country at Division II back then. You basically kind of get a bid to go to the Olympic Training Center. You can stay there as a resident, and I just basically decided not to. It was like, okay, am I going to carry on with my wrestling career? Plus, you had Daniel Cormier at that time that would have been at my weight, and you're going, can I really beat that guy? Yeah, I don't know. I'm a Division II guy. This is a long shot. Versus I have an opportunity to have my doctorate paid for, being a grad assistant coach, right? I'm super blue collar from Pittsburgh, right? So the opportunity I was the first in my family that went to college and graduated, and I'm the first to have my, postgraduate degree. So for me at the time, that was way more important than me to go in 2006 compete in a sport that was like largely not on the map, right?
So for somebody who has absolutely no idea what the differences may be, what were the differences you found in the traditional rehab approach to something like turf toe or the ACL injuries themselves, and what you found actually works kind of in conjunction with or the best?
Yeah. So it's funny. I think about this all the time. The story is we had a pitcher from the University of Cincinnati baseball team who was a senior and had a full labrum tear with some biceps tendon involvement. And the cool part when I was there, I got to go hang out with the orthopedic surgeons all the time. So I would be in the office when the athletes would come in, or I would take the athletes there. I knew what was going wrong with this kid. I knew that he had an MRI that was bad. So, I at the doctor's appointment, and, I'm basically imagining that they're going to say, okay, well, we're going to get this kid in surgery. So this is maybe sometime around December, January, before baseball season is starting. And they're like, no, you're going to rehab him. And I'm like, I'm going to do what? Right. But I thought, you had to have surgery whenever you have an injury like this, right? And so the style of rehab that we do, if you look into the ACL literature, there's a thing called a non-coper. And Pittsburgh guy, Hines Ward, is usually the story of somebody that was a coper that was able to play NFL football at a high level as a wide receiver, not a defensive tackle, right? Wide receiver, cutting mechanics, all that stuff is way harder than what you're seeing with a defensive lineman, or particularly any type of lineman. So fascinating that he is somebody that could cope without his ligament. And there was a group out of University of Delaware that was studying this at the time and going, okay, well, how do we rehab these without surgery? And so then you take that science and go, okay, well, we can do this with every joint in the body because every joint in the body behaves similar. Similar. The only difference is that the shapes of the joints and the muscles that are around them behave a little differently, but it's the same principle. So basically, a joint has to stay within a certain magnitude or range of motion to be able to function. And so, for example, you tear your ACL and it slips out of the joint, which is a subluxation or a dislocation. And so some people are able to use their nervous system to stabilize that joint in what we call, again, joint centration. So it stays in the center of axis of the range of motion that you're moving through without subluxing ultimately. And so again, that was super fascinating back then. So I started applying that same principle to what I was doing for my foot, which is also much harder than the traditional rehab, because now you have to be very safe, but you also have to have an intensity that's starting to replicate the loads and the speed of sport that you're using, but still be able to maintain that integrity. You got to be able to stay integrated and pattern your nervous system over and over. And again, the part I was having problem with, I was having pain, right? And so mentally, I'm going, stop, right? I had to take myself just past that point where I was afraid and say, okay, you can do this, right? And eventually my body started going, oh, we have control over this. My nervous system started feeling safe. And then progressively, I just got more and more control. And, I should knock on wood right now, but I have 10 years. I actually have more problems with my right foot now than I do with my left. It's kind of unbelievable.
Is that like because is that a repercussion of the other injury?
So arguably God blessed me with some bad foot mechanics, and it's a long story, but my son has the same issue. My dad has the same issue. Long story short, never met my grandpa until I was about 40 years old. And the coolest thing, when I was living in California, he came to visit me and I got to evaluate him, and he has the exact same problem. And so it was a genetic trait that was passed down. My first metatarsal is basically, shorter than it should be. And it puts my first metatarsal phalangeal joint, your first MTP joint, like in your thumb here on your toe, right where you get the bunion. It positions it in the wrong position. So could I have done anything to prevent it? I try not to look back. Wrestling shoes, those types of things might have not have been the best sport for me. You could have made a lot of arguments there, but I was probably predisposed to start having some problems. But I also look back and go, man, if I would have never have done this stuff, where would I be today? I would probably be a mess, right?
Wrestling shoes are closer to being barefoot than most standard shoes. Are people destroying their feet and their abilities wearing these Hokus or Rokus or whatever they are and these big clog hopper shoes all the time?
So it's funny. My college wrestling coach, I used to play racquetball with him. I write about this in the Strong Angle Way book, and he would always wear his wrestling shoes to play racquetball. And we were all a bunch of tender-footed wusses, and we'd always be like, "How's he doing this?" Right, like jumping around, running around in a racquetball court. So I went through the toe shoes and the minimal shoes and all of these things, and then one day it hit me. I'm like, I have wrestling shoes, and they have ankle support. Right. And so I find that the minimalist shoe sometimes is a little too minimalist, if that makes sense. Even especially at one point, people are running marathons in these shoes and, developing stress fractures and whatnot. So what I tell everybody is it's kind of like wearing a helmet in football versus also having tummy time for a baby. So if you have a child, that you want to do things to keep them off the back of their head so they don't get that flat scalded thing that can happen, right? And so it's the same thing. We want to get time in our bare feet. And then the question is specificity. How much time do you need? Right. And this is where this ability to evaluate comes in and try to determine what your programming needs to be. But if I'm going to be on a construction site, I'm going to wear steel toed shoes, just like I'm going to wear my helmet in football. Right. So there's a time and a place for each one. And again, coming back to all this research, and this is one of the reasons why I am critical of fitness, because people don't read the research and they just see a video or they just hear something and then they just take it and run with it without any context. They've really never studied the nervous system and how this stuff works. And then they just take it and then they beat it into the ground until they're hurt. And then they turn around and complain about what they didn't know. Right. And it's like, well, you had the opportunity. Everybody can be Goodwill Hunting, but most people are spending time watching cat videos all day. Right. And it's like, or, if you're really serious about this, go to somebody like Quentin that knows what he's doing, or somebody like me, and try to get better information before you just start winging it.
All right. So the flip side of that, and another question regarding Hines Ward, first off, what are we attributing the coper mechanism or the ability to cope like that to? Is it just his personality type, or is it his fascia? There's something about his body that isn't average. And how does he do that throughout a playing career with the loads of an NFL football player?
Yeah, and I would say some of it's still a little bit of a mystery, right? And that's the fun part about some of these. Some of it there is no answers. Some of it is structural, right? We have different morphology and shapes to our joints that make them more congruent or less congruent. And so if you go back to what I was talking about Bob Mangine and what we call these evaluation-based protocols or criterion progression-based protocols, right? So you're looking at evaluating something along the lines. Well, in the 70s and 80s, they were doing studies on fascia and connective tissue and morphology and looking at, well, surprise, everybody's different. We don't all have the same qualities, right? And some people basically, it's kind of a spectrum, but tend to be on one end versus the other, like loosey goosey, like the contortionist yoga people, or you're super tight and stiff. And each type of kind of connective tissue has a predisposition for developing a certain type of problems. And it's pretty easy to understand. If you're loosey goosey, you're more likely to develop your joint dislocation, subluxation problems. If you're super tight, you're going to end up with more itises and muscle tearing type of situation because you have so much tension. And remind me where we were going with this, because I'm getting a little too far into the
Hines Ward and his ability to be a coper.
So yeah, the argument would be is that he probably has some type of structural morphology that puts him into that category. And then obviously to just be at that level, he's got a better nervous system than the average person. Right. And he also spent years and years and years before the injury repetitively doing these motions and mastered them before he had an injury. And so it's much easier for someone like him that had that ability first, even when we train people. And this is one of the biggest blind spots that we have in this whole training, like training Hines Ward versus the 14-year-old kid playing the same position is completely different, right? Or even the 30-year-old guy that's trying to be Hines Ward on the weekend, what is it, like the Cincinnati Sports League used to have it where you play co-ed flag football, right? Type of scenario. That guy's not the same. And so the way that they're going to absorb their training and also their rehab is not going to be the same. But again, yes, the literature shows is that they have some type of neuromuscular ability to maintain the structural integrity of their body under dynamic movements. And that's the big difference. A lot of people can do it when you're just standing there, maybe doing even like something that's more challenging on your stability, like a single leg, squat or sit to stand or something like that. But now when we're cutting and being, the word I always talk about is being ambikinetic, where you have to use all four sides of your body the same. The big problem is after an injury, that inhibition creates a change in our movement sequencing. And for some reason, people like him are able to overcome that.
Yeah, and actually, if you compare him to the other wide receivers of his generation on his team, he was one tough dude, and he was a little undersized, and he was probably always adapted to avoiding contact, but then when he wanted to, he initiated contact quite well. So he's a special specimen for sure.
Yeah, and he was a quarterback, so he was a freak athlete, right? To be able to, go from playing one position at a high level to another, it's obviously a freak. And so again, we can screw that literature up too and say, well, you know what? Everybody should not have an ACL reconstruction, right? And it's like, again, there's criteria to make these decisions, and the literature's there.
Yeah.
Right.
So one of the subjects that did come up when I spoke with Quentin, which was interesting, is you just offered the example that some people will just look to the studies and then they'll just go run out to follow those, or they won't really read the studies and then they'll make the mistake of thinking that they can do something. So what about the gray area where we don't have studies on information that have definitive positive results, but now we kind of see it's there. It's there. There is people progressing in areas that the studies just haven't been done yet, or we haven't found a way to formulate them. Like, should we be self-experimenting?
Yeah, I saw this podcast that you guys were talking about this. Yeah, I think if you have the principles, and that's why I wrote this book. And so there's principles behind this type of decision making. And when we're asking questions like this, it's like, what is it? It's an evaluation, right? So how do we evaluate things? What is the code that you're holding your standard to? And that's what this strong angle is about, right? It's not just about a range of motion. It's about understanding the code behind the strong angle, which again, coming back to Hines Ward, he's able to keep his body in the strong angle where most people would fall into the weak angle. And so the real tell becomes two things. What's your ability to breathe when you're moving and switching directions, right? And can you maintain your ability to switch directions under more dynamic conditions, right? It's called the control chaos continuum, right? So we go from more of an intervention style of phase where we're working on like rehab isolation exercises, which should also be strong angle, which should also be ambikinetic. Look at everything from the floor and the foundation of connecting the entire body, right? We say these things and then we don't do it. Right. We'll say these things and then we'll do an isolation exercise and say, well, it's okay to forget about the rest of the body, but it's not true. Right. The rest of the body is still participating even on a clamshell type of exercise. Right. Simple. But we don't think about those things. And again, I need you to lead me back to where I was going here with the question
We were talking about
about the
self-experimentation
evidence.
and where we draw the line, what's appropriate, what's
Right.
inappropriate.
Right. And so once you understand what these codes are, it makes it easier for you to experiment. And I would say, you can't really advance the professions without experimentation, right? But what we see, kind of like what you were saying, and Quentin will kind of judge me for this too, because I fall into the physical therapy thing. We're terrified to hurt somebody. Right. And this is the other part. It's like, well, if you throw a baseball or you do jujitsu, you're just signing up, right? Like, hey, sign this, invisible contract. You're probably going to get hurt, right? Type of situation. So, but on that end, you have this, risk taking behavior that is basically ignoring that there's fundamental principles that are going to stop you from having a big setback. Now, the reason why those setbacks are so important is number one, you may never get back. Right. Number two, now you have to take a year off from doing the thing that you actually like doing because you got hurt doing something that was preparing you for the thing that you actually like to do. Doesn't make any sense. Get hurt running your marathon. Get your elbow dislocated doing a jiu-jitsu tournament, right? Don't get hurt training. Right. It doesn't make any sense. Right. So we have these gaps that are there with this like huge risk taking behavior on one end and this huge conservative scenario. And again, why? Because we have these blind spots and not being able to apply the code to understand, well, if you're doing it right, there's nothing to be scared of. Right. You don't have to worry about risk if you understand these principles. And then on the other end, right, there's no risk if you understand how to apply these principles. Right. And so I'm a little bit lucky because I also have Mike Maddox's equipment, right? Like I was telling you, Quentin and I just got done doing a super hard workout, but it's all designed to try to give you more body awareness to when your kinetic chain is breaking down. So you basically practice doing that in the workout. It puts you in a mental flow states because you're so connected. It's a lot like jujitsu. Actually, I think that's one of the reasons people like it is immediately you're like, I have to focus and engage here, or I'm going to get my arm ripped off type of thing. Right. And so the strong angle conditioning stuff that we do is very similar, but you don't have to worry about getting your arm ripped off. The consequences aren't as bad, but I always joke about this. It's like reading for smart people. The more of have more motor control and more kinesthesia you have, the faster you learn these motor patterns with this equipment that I have. But ultimately, it's designed to be very safe, but allow you to have a very high intense training session or a lower intense training session. And that's where we find these challenges. When do you do what and why? Right. And it really comes again back to having a better evaluation lens to understand this stuff.
This may be the most neglected area of training a sport like jujitsu or anything in midlife where there's actual consequences for people who do not have the history, do not have the experience, but want to engage in sport. They see something from the outside, they walk through the doors, they see what's going on inside, and then nobody actually gives them the blueprint to do this, how to approach it, at what levels, how far to go in their training before they get this injury. And so many of those blue belts all quitting. It happens so often that we have this like stereotype that really is true. And it's mostly because, in my opinion, people aren't prepared properly for what foundation they need to lay and where they need to put those parameters and like those guidelines. Is your book a blueprint for people like this?
Nice. You just segued right into it. That's what exactly what the book is about, right? And so that is literally everything that you were saying right there. My brain was going, it's in the book, it's in the book. So yeah, so I talk a lot about in the book about self-control versus self-mastery. And so one of the things we'll say is you got to start with the end in mind, right? I want to be a, 10th degree, 50 stripe black belt jujitsu master, right? Well, the people that have gotten to that level in the past have taken a torturous, treacherous path to get there, where there's many who have been sacrificed along the way. And it's just been a battle of attrition. And even that's kind of the American mindset, right? Is to just survive, right? We got to redline everything. And then whoever survives, survival of the fittest, right? And actually, that's where the word fitness comes from. It's a biology term that looks at how well we pass our genetics off to the next offspring. That's the original definition of fitness, right? But we need a new definition of fitness, which is part of why I'm doing this. And so basically, it's funny. I keep losing my train of thought because there's so much on this. So in the Strong Angle book, the idea is if you're going to start with the end in mind, right, you want to be clearly defined and well aligned with what that is. So I need to be clearly defined. Like we'll say things like mastery, or you got to have passion, or you just got to grind. It doesn't mean anything. There's literally no definition, right? It is poorly defined, but people say this stuff all the time. They coach people on it all the time. And all of it is a directional trigger, right? But where am I going? Right? What's the direction I'm going in? Well, when we start on all pursuits of wellness and, performance, they all end in mastery and leadership. And so when you start out at the beginning, however, you don't know that that's where you're going. So every day you're investing in things that are actually not leading you to the future that you're fighting for. And you don't realize it. That's the weak angle.
Mm-hmm.
You keep putting yourself in the weak angle over and over and over again because you're actually not aligned with the future that you're fighting for, which is to become a master at what you're doing and also to become a leader. Those things typically actually, and you probably know this along your journey, they end up happening to you. People start following you, whether you're actually paying attention to your leadership or not, and you're developing mastery through this process, whether you were using the principles of mastery or not. And so when you don't use those principles, it makes it super inefficient. And what's happened is we've just accepted that. We've accepted that that's just the pathway that we have to go through. And this is one of the reasons I wrote the book and what I talk about. We have all these elite high performers, which I've been so lucky to work with Rhonda and all these different people and Antonio Brown, see what they're really like. What is it really at the elite? Because one of the things that we talk about is pattern recognition and evaluation. Well, how do you recognize a pattern that you've never seen before? Right. So now we're kind of at the mercy of other people that have some type of leadership responsibility to follow, but those leaders don't know where they're leading us. right? So how are they going to tell us where to go when they don't know where they're going at the same time because they've never seen these other patterns before? And so, and even in, you know this in jujitsu, it's always been, well, I'm going to hold all this knowledge in over here so nobody else can get it type of thing, right? I don't want the McDojos knowing what we're doing over in this scenario, right? And really, the Marinovich system was a lot like that in the old days. They didn't want everybody to know what they were doing, right? They were trying to keep the information, be the gatekeepers that would never open the gate. I hope that made sense. I know I jumped around a little.
No, it made complete sense. And actually, I put together so many things since I started this. And one of them was a grappler survival guide. And the fundamental principles are you should be aiming for the end result. And in one way, neglecting yourself in the moment, because if your ego takes over in the moment, it's going to be an obstacle to being on the mat tomorrow. If you overtrain right now, it's going to be an obstacle to be on the mat tomorrow. And this is a game of reps. You know for sure there is no replacement for reps. So a lot of the guys that have started and quit, they start in midlife. They're dealing with people in a gym that are starting in young life that have completely different bodies, completely different abilities. And we're probably operating from what you would classify as the weak angle more often than not. I mean, just because they do not have the knowledge or the wisdom and the actual example of somebody who starts a little later, but is there every day, or is there enough that they're present, that they can make it through this. So in wrestling, is it the same? It's a young man's sport. There's not too many guys that are out there. I guess RAF might be changing that a little bit, a little older demographic in wrestling, but is there somebody like presenting this to wrestling?
You know, and the first thing that I jumped to mentally whenever you were talking about this, the difference with wrestling is that we compete way more frequently. So you're really training for much more competition than necessarily even mastery. One of the kids that I was working with who was an All-American at Gannon University the last year, he basically was still practicing, trying to learn new moves and implement new strategy way too late in the season. Right. And I said, hey, man, Nick, this is time to get ready for competition, right? Nationals is 2 months away. You need to be refining your competitive strategy. You can still play some games and, be innovative, but right now it's time for a consistent approach. How are you going to wrestle in the third period when it's tied at 6-6, right? And you need to win to move on in the blood round. Right? You need to be preparing for that versus I'm going to learn a new omoplata X guard type of scenario. Right. And I think that's one of the big things. Jiu-jitsu, there's so many options. Right. It's like difference between wrestling is like checkers and jiu-jitsu is like chess. So you can flow and do all of these things in jiu-jitsu and practice all of these things even more and then even be less prepared for competition, if that makes
For
sense.
sure.
But at the same time, it depends on what your goal is. Right. And coming back to what was the
I
main
actually
principle?
I actually think there's a lot of jujitsu masters and people that are really experienced who would actually give the same advice, who would actually say, look, forget all the extra stuff that you want to learn and master these basics and make this part of your game, your strategy, and make it unbeatable and stick with it. So you were basically saying this athlete was trying to apply new things too late in the season when they need to be ready for competition rather than experimentation. And the
Right.
difference is
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah. Dylan Friedman, I don't know if you know him. I always said I was going to shout him out for this. He's a guy that I worked with a few years ago, high level black belt jujitsu guy. And he would say, you got to do the basics before the exotic. Right. And so in jujitsu, particular wrestling's getting more like that, though. And you're seeing it. The kids like doing more of the fancy stuff. It gets more likes on social media and more eyeballs on it. Right. And they also, you see somebody doing that at the David Taylor did this or whatever. And it's like, hold on, man, you're not David Taylor, right? David Taylor has the basics down. That's what's allowing him to innovate on top of it. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of similarities in what we do with wrestling. But and I've heard other people talk about this before. Wrestling selects for probably two things that are a little different, maybe three, is that it selects for athleticism because you have to be explosive and fast in wrestling. Like it just is. Even the slow guys in wrestling are fast and explosive, right? And then it selects for body composition, right? Because of the way the weight classes are and how many times you have to compete in that short period of time. Where in these sports where you have a lot of range in between, the different combat sports, right? Whether it's MMA or jiu-jitsu, you have a lot of time in between competition usually. So you can kind of balloon up and come back down and cheat on the weight cutting a little bit more. I know it's getting better and you have to weigh in your gi and all that type of stuff. But wrestling, when you're wrestling 40 matches in a season, it's a little bit different, right? And then I think particularly because wrestling is chess, you don't have dudes that show up to wrestling just that are, you know what, I think I want to try to get my butt kicked every day, right? It's not like that. Wrestling really tests people that want to get broken every practice, right? Like there's some sickness that we have that's like, yeah, I want to go do the hardest thing that I can to test myself every single day. It's not as much of that skill acquisition flow state as it is to how can I get myself into this situation where I'm so tired that I can barely function and then do one more, right? We have that sickness, right?
How important are biomechanics for everybody you're working with?
I think it's super important, right? And I think there's an element to, especially in the beginning phase, that you just have to do something, right, to get started. And this is I look at everything very similar to what we see in the belt systems, right? You don't tell a white belt to do the same thing that you would tell a black belt, right? But the problem is the white belt will look at a purple belt and think they know what the black belt knows because they can't judge, right? But the more body awareness, and this is kind of what I was going to say a few minutes ago, we see, especially I think in jujitsu today, guys that played other sports or some other type of discipline, they know how to train. And so they can take that and come into jujitsu. Like I have a buddy that was a college basketball player, Chris Doobie. He's up in Erie, Pennsylvania, black belt guy, and a lifelong friend of mine now, and basically he played Division I basketball. So when he got into jujitsu, he was like, look, I'm going to take the same mentality that I had to gain these skills in basketball and get them into grappling, right? And so not everybody's starting out at the same place ultimately, which makes it hard sometimes to answer these questions. But we know people that the more kinesthetically aware that you are, the better athlete that you are, the better you're going to absorb. Again, just like that, thing I said about smart people reading books, right? They're going to get more out of it faster.
Yeah, in the last couple episodes, I've come into the same conclusion. One person made it a X and a Y axis kind of thing, and he's like, "You're doing this Y axis sport like jujitsu, but you're not preparing a
Yeah, I
foundation."
saw that.
And then another one was saying the same exact thing with his movement. Is introducing his lower belts to proper movements, and he's seeing that the better they move, the better they will be getting at jujitsu, regardless of where they started. So
Now, where we struggle with that is that it's like if I say, when you're sweeping somebody, what muscle do you want to feel it in? Right, no muscles, right? And so it's not, you don't want your glute or your quad working more than another. And so we have to be careful how we teach biomechanics because we usually have to break it down into parts and then build it back up. What we're not very good at is taking the parts and integrating them back in. So usually what people will do is they'll teach gross biomechanics movements, but they don't see that the parts are dysfunctioning, or they're obsessed with the parts dysfunctioning and then they don't know how to correlate that back in. Framing is one of the best examples. People in jujitsu and wrestling, they like to pick their dominant side because it's the easier side, and then they won't work on their weak side typically, which is a huge disadvantage in these sports. But you'll even see differences in mechanics where when somebody's framing, they will basically engage their shoulder blade. I know I'm blocking the camera right here. They'll engage their scapula on one side, and then on the other, they round the scapula forward like this, and they just frame with their elbow. Right. So it looks like you're doing the same thing, but it is not even close. Your kinetic chain is literally more connected on one side versus the other. And the funny part is it's not always on your dominant side. It can just be the way that you're doing it and you're not aware of it until all of a sudden, man, that biceps tendon is really hurting in my shoulder. Well, it's not because you need to do 50 new rehab exercises in isolation. It's because you're framing incorrectly, right? In that gross biomechanical scenario, and nobody's catching it. And you may also have some deficits in your rotator cuff and your scapula or your serratus anterior that's not engaging the way that you need it to be. So again, being able to evaluate those things is the trick. And ultimately, you came back to it and said it a few minutes ago. Why I specialized in what I specialized in was because I knew that there was a huge blind spot and really a blue ocean in this return to sports understanding. And so we always look at that like it's only for people people that are coming back from injuries. But I thought about this years ago. It's called return to sport, right? So why are we not using those principles when we are returning back to sport, let's say off-season conditioning going into in-season? We don't use those same principles of conditioning the body to be prepared for what we're getting ready to do next. It's just, let's try to VO2 max as much as we possibly can, or whatever these hard qualities are, right? We leave the Quentin soft qualities out of it.
So what elementary level advice would you offer people, and not even just midlifers, but people in jiu-jitsu, you see it especially, that play a predominantly one-sided game? And whether or not that's right or not, it's the fact. Most people do play a one-sided guard or a one-sided approach and attack, and we have these imbalances that are built in just based upon what we're doing. Whatever, 75% of our active life and or of our adult life when we're doing this. So, like myself, I'm playing a right-sided game. I'm closing down my knee and elbow connection here differently than here. I experienced this in the surf world. I was completely imbalanced. Riding regular, my right hip would get compounded, and I would have IT issues on
Oh,
that
I
side.
saw that. Yeah. I saw you talking about that. Yeah.
So then how do we tell these guys who are 35, 40 years old, who are going to be doing this sport that we love, we know it's damaging, but we kind of want to undo some of the compounding, and how do we put ourselves back together as we go?
So I had the same problem. Again, I had a left foot injury. I was a right leg lead, and sometimes I would switch to my left just to confuse people, but I couldn't do much off of my left at all. But if you're wrestling against me, you didn't know that, right? I would switch my stance and change, but I knew that I could only really shoot off of my right leg, right? But it made me shoot a million times off of my right leg versus my left. And now I have a hip problem on my right side. And that's actually why we developed the up squat, because basically anytime that you favor one side of the body, typically the leak is actually in your knee, especially in a standing position. And then what happens is your pelvis shifts and moves, and then your hip joint can't stay in the right alignment, right? The sockets of your hips are in your pelvis. And so when your pelvis moves, it changes the position of the sockets of your hips, which changes the connection on your femurs. And so once you start to favor one side, the hips are going to be the first thing that basically starts to take up the load, but they're such a they have so much structural integrity, it takes a while for them to break down. So, and then basically by the time you start feeling pain, your mechanics are off, your pelvic floor is not working correctly, one hip flexor is pulling more than the other, or whatever. So first of all, I'm going to come back to the answer. So even in like babies and in children and occupational therapy evaluations, we look at what's called bilateral coordination. Can they use both hands? Will they reach for a ball with both hands? And if they can't, we look at that like, oh, there might be a big neurological deficit. There's a part of the developmental process where they're going to be less likely to do that the younger they are. The side dominance to be right-handed or left-handed, it shows really early on. Where that is important as well, we also have this issue principle that we call the crossover effect. And it's one of the things that we use with stroke rehab. So, if you lose function of your entire left arm, we will train the right arm, because the way that the brain is, the corpus callosum, if you ever look at the brain, it has a crossing effect. We know that the left side controls the right side, right? That familiar. I know I'm trying not to be too technical here, right? So right brain versus left brain. And this also is this idea of ambikinetic, right? The masters are able to use both sides of their brain. They don't just say, oh, I'm just one side dominant, I'm all logical, or I'm all creative, right? They end up developing both sides. And again, how long does that take? So that bilateral coordination and that crossover effect, you want to work your weak side because it actually makes your strong side better. And we don't think of it that way. So a lot of times we just say, well, I'm going to just go with my strength scenario. Then on top of that, you learn more when you work on your weak side, trying to work on versus always working on your right side. Now I'm going to come back to it though. There's a time and a place, right? I'm not going to try something in competition with my weak side that I know is not going to work just to try it, unless it's the time and the place for you to do that. Maybe there is a competition where you just want to go into and try some stuff, right? But if it's a national championship or a qualifier or something along those lines, do what works, right? Know when it's time to compete, and then know when it's time to train and experiment. They're two different things.
So what you're suggesting is that Regardless of the reps on our good side that we're going to give up, we will be strengthening our good side to go ahead and practice on our weak side or our non-favored, non-dominant side when we can, when it's appropriate.
Right. And if you don't, you're actually leaving a lot on the table and you don't realize it. Even if you're not planning on using it, you will learn so much more about your biomechanics if you train that weak side. And again, some of it's time and it's like well, the question is, how bad do you want your goals? Are you going to walk the walk or are you just talking the talk, right? At the end of the day, right? And, people make excuses all the time and we tend to go towards our comfort zone. It's hard. I mean, most people can't even comb their hair with their non-dominant hand.
I was just going to go there with neuroplasticity. Should we go ahead and brush our teeth with the other hand and start doing the normal things that we do with our strong side with our weak side?
So, and this is where you got to be careful. And this is why I love my wobbler, and not to just pitch all of my stuff, but it's this stuff that I have was designed for a purpose, right? It wasn't just me, being like, oh, look at me type of thing. Right. And so, and I think actually part of the where I screwed my hip up was when I first started doing striking in MMA, because I was a right foot lead, they actually made me go into a left-handed stance. Right. And this goes for almost anything. There's a 60 to 40% weight shifting and rotation that goes on with every human biomechanical movement. So somewhere in this range of 40 to 60 to 60, 40, and they're all the same. So they go with this weight shifting and then this rotation, right? So it's the reason why whenever you go to throw with your dominant hand, it looks like this. And when you throw with your non-dominant hand, it looks like this, because you don't get the rotation and the weight shifting together. So when you throw, it's the same motion, right? So when I'm here, it should be the same, just like when I'm trying to throw a punch. But what happens is when you don't understand that biomechanical principle, you end up grinding somewhere, not realizing that you're doing it wrong. So if you are going to try to do your non-dominant side, you really want to think about how the mechanics behind it are working. What is working on your dominant side? How are you doing that? You want to try to replicate that as much as possible. And again, that requires a lowering of the intensity. If I work on my non-dominant weak side only in live sparring, I'm not going to really learn very much, right? So, and again, there's that time and that place, but you have to be able to have the sensory feedback to be able to get the neuroplasticity that you're looking for. Particularly if sensory, everything is sensory motor. It's the same reason why, like, when you go to the dentist and you get an injection in your mouth, there's nothing wrong with your muscles. It's the sensation, right? Because you can't feel. So it's the same thing. Everything, even the strong angle is a feeling. It's a feeling of your pure power potential. So when you're in that strong angle, So naturally, you will have this tendency to figure it out on your dominant side, but then your weak side's lagging behind. And that weak side is also part of that dominant side. So if the weak side's not doing what it needs to do, you're also leaving power on the table. And really, efficiency has more to do with it.
So moving into the wobbler, because it's fascinating for me. I mean, I told you before we started recording, I played a lot on balance boards and on BOSUs and stability balls, but this is different. This is a full range of movement that you can't really replicate on any of those other devices the same. Would you be putting people on this and then working their weak side with like just reflex actions, very low? Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I have a lady that had a stroke a couple years ago. She's only 40 years old. And basically, we do this all the time because of the sensory feedback. She can't get the correct sensory feedback because her nervous system doesn't work the same way anymore. But the wobbler gives her this subtle rotational and weight shifting input that allows her to self-correct her mechanics. And so it's that sensitive, even for somebody, that has that type of issue. Yes, that's what it's designed to do. Almost all of the stuff that we use, even the SuperCAT and the accelerator machines, number one, they were designed for a specific purpose. And those machines, particularly rate of force production and rate of force absorption, and they're teaching you what the right thing is to do. And so the one big difference between the wobbler and all that instability training. So when you train instability, you're getting proprioceptive awareness, but you're also struggling to move dynamically proactively. So we don't always see a much of a carryover other than like what you're doing is connection, right? So you're getting more proprioceptively connected. But then when we go to move dynamically, there's some limits there that we can argue. And again, if you're a better athlete, you're probably going to take some of that stability that you gained and put it into what you're doing. The lesser athlete's not going to convert as well. So then we also have this idea between reactive stabilization or reactive balancing versus proactive. And so when we move, it's proactive. And so sometimes we encounter some type of what we call a perturbation that it makes us have to react to it. Somebody bumps you in a basketball game or offline, or in a soccer match, you're trying to, go for the ball and somebody hits you, right? And, that's the contact that's made that you need to react to it. And that's important. And that level of reaction time is the worst, or how do I want to say, the hardest thing to get back after an injury. So that's one of the reasons why it became such a big thing, was because that level of reactive proprioception, we realized that there was a huge deficit towards the end when in the return to sports phase. And so also most people have these deficits. So when they get on there initially, they're like, oh, this is helping, but they're actually just practicing being stiff. And so again, coming back to breathing and all of these things, you should be able to move. Even when we're doing reactive balancing, I always tell people you should feel like you can jump or switch directions, or you're too unstable.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. I don't want to put you in a condition where you're so unstable that you have to lock yourself in place to be able to hold it. And particularly what starts to happen is you start losing your breathing mechanics and your pelvic floor stiffens and all this stuff that I could go on and on about. But the wobbler is designed to be proactive. And so you're in control of it, but it's giving you feedback, but it's not as dangerous as a skateboard, which is like,
Right.
or the endo board. You ever ride an endo board?
That's exactly where I started, was endo boards.
Yeah. My wife broke her arm the first time we got the endo board. She walked in the clinic and was like, I'm a physical therapist. I've done balance exercises my entire life. And again, reactive, not proactive, right? Exactly. And so the thing flies out and she lands on her elbow and
So
go ahead.
with that said, when somebody, I know this isn't the normal typical situation, but when somebody does kind of obsess over tools like that, modalities like that, like myself, and I push myself to a limit where I really don't feel there's any instability there. I'm on the slack line, the loosest slack line I could find on the market. I've got it stretched all the way across the yard so that it's called a surfer in the center. When you get to the point where you do breathe well like that, you do feel stable in unstable environments. Am I still kind of, what's the word for it, inhibiting my explosive and reactive abilities by training in that too much? Or is that just something that's at this point, I don't know, I guess complementary?
Yeah, I'll start where my brain is going, and then maybe you could lead me back to that. But so one of the things we don't do a very good job of, again, is assessing the scenario, right? It's just like, oh, I'm going to try this, right? And we know with all these assessments that we do that most times people have deficits, whether they've ever had an injury or not. But if you're 47, most of the time you've had some type of injury, and that injury has literally been infecting every part of your kinetic chain. Right. And so we get into something that makes us get more connection to our kinetic chain and more awareness to it. And then the principle of initial gains kicks in. Right. And so we start seeing these improvements early on, but largely a lot of times they rapidly diminish. And then we see things that are in a kind of a culprit in this. I'll do some things that look weird, but what I'm trying to do is provide proprioceptive input to people so they can feel something, so they can self-correct their biomechanics. But in a lot of this instability training, it's like trying to shoot a cannon out of a canoe. You just literally are training an unstable position where you have no power, right? But at the same time, again, I'm coming back to most people are very unstable when you do these assessments initially. And they don't realize that they're walking around with these really huge inefficiencies. Movement economy is the biggest thing. And so the trick is that we're taking stability and strength and trying to convert it into power, and then into power endurance or power conditioning or sprint repeatability. And that's where we're really poor. And that's why I started talking about the breathing component, because if we're training the body to be so stiff that our breathing pattern is altering itself, right, and and getting paradoxical, when you go to take it into something where you need to express in chaos, particularly, your breathing pattern is going to revert back to how you've been training it. And so you're going to think that you're gassing out and getting tired because your cardiovascular system is wrong. So then what do? You double down on cardio. Well, it's not that. It's just your movement economy is not as good as it needs to be because all you've been doing is training this initial gains of these stability exercises or working on patterns like the ball work, for example. I love the ball work, but all you're doing is proprioceptive patterning, right? You're learning my arm goes here, my arm goes here, right? My arm goes here, my arm goes here. I know where my body is in space, but it doesn't necessarily mean that when I take that and I do something that's, where I really need those skills, that it's necessarily going to directly transfer over. We have to take those principles and say, okay, am I unstable or am I stable here? Am I in the strong angle or am I in the weak angle, right? Do I have a position of leverage or don't I? Right. And what's the appropriate next move? And then and again, that's one of the reasons why jiu-jitsu is so beautiful, right? Is because it sets the next move up. Every movement is setting up the next thing. Right. And again, if we don't want to be unstable, that's for sure. Right. But we have to have enough stability that we can have this balance between tension and relaxation. And that's what I call the strong angle. And it's like the 1-inch punch. Again, if I have the ability to jump or change directions in any position, it means that I can 1-inch punch. Right. And so most of the time we have to use a wind up or something along those lines, which puts us at risk for being in an unstable position. And that's again coming back to why people hurt their shoulders and why people, injure their knees, because they need more weight shifting and rotation than is actually required for the movement because they're not staying integrated and connected in that range. Does that make sense? I know that's a
No, it makes complete sense.
okay.
So when you come to something like the SuperCAT, obviously these are not readily available, is a good way to put it. They're not on every corner. Are there things that you've utilized that mimic this in areas where you couldn't get to the machinery? Or when you have somebody who's working remote who just can't get access to it?
Yeah. So the heavy rope jump rope, I got a lot of the history of this because I'm partners with Mike Maddox, the guy that invented the accelerating isokinetic machine. So Barney Fuller invented the SuperCAT, who worked with Mike. And so what they were trying to do back then, which is amazing because this is coming into the late 70s, they realized that exercise patterns weren't the same as what we do in the expression phase in chaos of a jumping pattern, particularly, or a running pattern. And they knew that if you conditioned the wrong pattern, that was going to cause you to have diminishing returns in the actual athletic mechanics that you were looking for. So that machine was created to stop having people jumping with barbell on their back. They realized that was a really inefficient way, particularly the weak angle where this partially comes from is that a weight always overloads the weakest angle in the joint range of motion. And that's one of the reasons why in therapy, you don't see us using heavy weights, especially in the beginning, because that repaired tissue is just going to tear off. And that's literally what's happening in weightlifting, right? The weight is literally ripping your arm off of your body, and your arm is trying to figure out how to stop that from happening first, then also to how to maintain movement without that connective tissue being ripped apart, like literally, right? And so now if I add speed and load, what am I going to get? More destruction. Right. And so the SuperCAT was engineered so you get less destruction, but it also has a rigid lever arm. Right. And so that rigid lever arm almost creates a little bit too much stability where you can advance your speed and your load and still be leaking underneath, if that makes sense. And so, right. And so in the isokinetic machine, we can do the same, but that's also the reason why we invented the up squat that we're going to be rolling out, is because the inventor of the isokinetic machine, who was partners with the SuperCAT, the guy, I don't know if I said this a minute ago, but Barney Fuller worked for Mike Maddox. These guys worked together, and then Barney left and started the Powernetics company. But Mike realized a few years back that, I think he had this in the back of his mind for a long time, that those machines didn't necessarily keep the integrity of the body. We're relying on the athlete to maintain their integrity. In PT, we don't do that. In PT, we structure the environment and the equipment and the system to make sure that you're getting the proprioceptive feedback that you need to have to do the right motion, because if you don't, the penalty is quick. right? In training, the penalty takes a while. The next thing you know, you're like, oh, why is my knee hurting? Right. And again, I could go on
This-
and on, but we also have another machine that's called the plyometric jumper. That's a version of Mike's machine that has a free harness that does the same thing. It allows you to hold on. It also has a spring loaded floor base to it. So we're taking some of those loads out so we can do a lot of repetitions with a better jumping mechanic. And again, it's not that I don't do the SuperCAT. It's what is appropriate as I evaluate the situation to go, where do I want to be? What tools do I want to use? Just like a surgeon. You don't want to go to a surgeon and he says, oh, I'm going to use this spoon to cut your shoulder open right now, right? You want them to use lasers and scalpels, right? But that's the decision making that the surgeon has to make.
So is part of that because of liability when you talk about in rehab?
Yeah, there's some liability there, but I think if you look at physical therapists, it's funny, Quentin and I have been talking about this. Our biggest problem in our profession is actually that most of us have a Peace Corps gene, where it's like we would volunteer to do this work and not get paid for it. Right. And so it's one of the things that, I've been challenged with my entire career because I'm a results guy. Right. And so it's like the reason why we do evaluations is to get results. Why even do evaluations if you don't care about the results? Right. And so sometimes we get into, if we're just nice and we help people, right, we did our job, but really when we measure it functionally, we didn't actually get people very far. And our system is set up like that. And I know there's just like any other profession, there's bad people and good people, but the insurance companies do skew what we're doing. But at the same time, they also force us to objectively measure function to some degree. So we know that we're trying to improve some level of function, but how much purity do we actually have in that? Now, coming back to liability, the liability actually usually falls on the surgeon much more than us. PTs, my liability insurance is like $500 a year. Why? Because we never hurt anybody. We have a system that's designed to improve self-efficacy. My job, if I was working with you, Josh, and you come in to see me, you're here, right? And I want to get you to here, right? I want to progressively, stepwise here to the point where, you blow your Achilles out or your hip is bothering you and you're like, I want to run a marathon. And I'm like, dude, when's the last time you ran? You're like, I don't care. I feel great. I want to run a marathon. It's like, whoa, slow down, right? Hold on. But the reason is because your own perception of your capability is now improved so much. You're like, oh, I can do this. I could try this. I could do this. I'll go do jiu-jitsu. I'll go do boxing, whatever. And that's a sign to me that I'm doing my job. Right. At the same time, though, I think when you're working with people acute, you do see some of the worst scenarios. And there's a healthy fear in these really weak people that you're seeing. Not everybody's Antonio Brown or Hines Ward. Right. And I'll never forget my cousin Tyrell Sales from Penn State was working with me his first year out of school. He was working with me in my PT office. He comes out of the room and he's like, hey, I'm working with this lady in here. She can't get up off the table. I was like, well, yeah, you got to help her. Right. And he's like, she can't get up over the table with her own power. I was like, yeah, you got to help her. Right. And his mind was blown away that there was somebody, because he was young. He's never been in this medical environment. He's never worked in the hospital where you see people at that low level of function. And actually, this is where I said this after that years ago. Like, you think you know strength until you see somebody in that situation. And then when they overcome that and then they're going up and down the stairs and running and all of that stuff, that's real strength, not squatting 500 pounds, right? Especially when you could squat 400 last year, right? And it's like, oh yeah, wow, yeah, that was hard for you, right? And that's one of our challenges, right? We look at what athletic people can do, and we say, well, that's the standard, right? And I think
Unfortunately,
there's
it's
a
not.
lot of blind spots there.
Yeah. We didn't get into half the stuff I wanted to talk about, to be honest. And I know you got another appointment coming
I
up.
was gonna say let's do another one, man.
Bro, that would be excellent. Part 2 would be awesome. One way I've been ending the shows or getting to the close of the shows lately, and I really like, is give me one word. Give the audience one word and why.
Can it be 3 words? The
I mean,
strong angle.
the strong angle. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? If you're interested in any of this stuff, like, this is not something I made up, right? This is something one day I write about it in the book. I understood the principle of the strong angle and I was consistently putting myself in a weak angle position. And all of a sudden it hit me. And I was literally so pissed at myself. I'm supposed to be like this expert. That's why Quentin sought me out, all of this stuff, right? I've been kind of behind the scenes. Nobody knows who I am, but I've been working on this for 20 years, right? And I'm connected to all these people in the system. And here I am doing the wrong biomechanical pattern when I've been thinking I was in the strong angle and I wasn't. And it was only because I wasn't asking that question. Right. And then from there, I went, oh my gosh, if I'm doing this wrong, everybody's doing it wrong, not because they're wrong, because they're not asking the right question. Am I in the strong angle or am I in the weak angle? Just ask that question. Take the time in the moment, right? Because momentum is moment to moment to moment towards the future that we're fighting for. So if I want to manage the moment, all I have to do is say, am I in the strong angle or the weak angle?
Awesome. All right. We got to schedule part 2, and you are in St. Pete from our Sarasota. Sarasota, you're around the corner. I might drop in on you.
You're here.
I'm in Hollywood, so I've got family.
Okay, nice.
I've got all kinds of family on that coast. But yeah, when I saw where your gym was, I was like, oh, this is good to know. Good to know, because I actually have contemplated training over there many times, but I might have to drop in on you for sure.
Nice. I just signed an LOI for a new location, so I may be maybe when you get here, I might be in a brand new location. I'm getting ready to start my my own thing back up, so I'm pretty excited about that.
Awesome, congrats. So, tell the audience, besides the strong angle way, it's on Amazon and your website, correct? Yeah,
Correct.
get the book. We'll lead all the listeners to you. Where else can they find you?
Yeah, and on the website, another thing I have a bunch of free stuff, right? So one of the things about asking questions and understanding the evaluations, I kind of thought about this years ago. There's just certain questions that you should know the answers to. So in the book, I kind of propose it. I don't say it exactly that way. And then in the free course that I have, it basically has you ask a bunch of questions. One is, how do you feel when you're performing at your best? That's like a question that everybody should know the answer to, but most people never ask. And then I also have a free assessment on there that takes you through a battery of mobility tests that, again, like you shouldn't have to go to a physical therapist to understand the true test for your hamstring length, right? And so then I'm at Dr. Lyneil on Instagram, the Strong Angle on YouTube, right? And I'm trying to give as much away for free as I can. And then I have some paid stuff too that I don't mind making money either. So if people are interested.
We got to eat, and what we're doing for the community, both, I think we both have focused on getting a lot of free information out there, and that's how we got here in the first place. So thank you for joining me. We'll definitely schedule part 2 because there's a ton more to get into. But you guys go check out the Wobbler too. The Wobbler is pretty rad.
It's fun. Like that's one of the things I say all the time. It's got to be the most fun piece of equipment in the whole fitness industry. So put your favorite music on and dance around your living room.
Feel the gains.
Yeah, right. Literally.
All right, brother. Thank you very much. You guys have a great day. And yeah, we'll get back with you part 2 when we can. Thanks, Doc.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for watching today's episode. And as always, go to Lineage Provisions for 15% off of the best protein from regenerative agriculture. And you know my personal favorite, Lineage Provisions. 15% off, code Josh Button. You guys enjoy. Have a great day.